Hey, welcome back. So now that we know about a setter, what a setter is, or the set function, let's look at a getter, or the get magic function. So normally, if let me remove this here for a second. So normally if I try to echo out a property that does not exist, like here, I will get an error. So let's see that in action. So undefined property database password, which is correct. Okay. And now what can we do about this? So if you don't want this to be happening, oh, and by the way, if I call out one that actually exists, host name, for example, I will get a result without an error like that. But now there's a way to do this so that if instead of throwing an error, it can just run a magic function. So if I add the function, so remember it must be public, I put 2 underscores and say get like this, and I will put name in there like so. Now it expects 1 parameter here, just like here this one expects 2, this one expects 1. If you don't add a parameter like this, you will get that error which says must take exactly 1 argument. Okay, so let's add that argument. Now this argument represents, just like this one name here, it represents this word there. Now like I said before, you don't have to name it name. It can be any variable like this. It doesn't really matter. You can name it anything you want, and then now you see we don't get an error. And the reason is that now instead of throwing an error, it's just running this function, but this function is empty. So this is why we're getting an empty space. So we can just write something like that property does not exist. That way they can know that that property does not exist, or something like that. So you can easily remove that error issue in case someone tries to retrieve this one. Now, because this name contains that, we can say, we can make the message more personal. We can say the property, and then let's put that property name does not exist, something like this. So if I refresh now, you see the property password does not exist, like that. You can even put quotations like that to make it more readable, and say the property password does not exist. So if I put 2 there, you see that it reflects that, sorry. So the property password 2 does not exist. Okay, so this is one way of using the getter like this, but this is not very useful. Instead, we can use it to get some other data in case somebody tries to what's this? To retrieve password which does not exist. We could just return, we can just tell them we return a no like this. This is entirely up to you. We return a no value like that, which of course we're not going to see anything here. But the other thing we could do is actually create this thing they're trying to retrieve. So for example, they're trying to retrieve password, right? And password name is there. So what I will do here is I will say instead, I will say this name. Now name of course represents password in this case, is equal to no, like that. So we just set it to an empty value, or just so we can be able to see it in there. NA, something like this. This name is equal to NA, and then return this name, like so. Okay, so hopefully you understand what's going on here. So I'm trying to retrieve a property that does not exist, but then what it does is it sets the property for me and then returns the value. So here it gives it a default value. Wait a minute, undefined property database password on line 22. What is happening? What is happening? Oh, because I have a setter here, right? So you see, I'm trying to set something and the setter is responding. So what can we do when we want to set? I will just do that. Okay. Now, if I don't want to be dealing with the setter, I can just simply remove it, and then this will work as it's supposed to work. But even like this, it will work because it will call the setter. I'm trying to set something that doesn't exist, and then it will set it for me, which is fine. So if I do this now, you get the NA. You'll get the same result if you remove set, because set still works. You can still set something that doesn't exist in a class, so that will work just the same, as you can see here. But since we have the set there, let's just leave it be. It will do the work for us. So this is one way you can avoid such errors. You just tell it to set a default value and then just return that value as it is. But you can do even more than this. For example, let's say you have some data in a database. Maybe there's a row of data and you want to get a particular column of data from there. So let's see how we can actually do that. So we forget about setting this item there altogether. For as long as it doesn't exist, we just know that, okay, if this property doesn't exist, then let's read from the database instead. Okay, so let's create a fake database. I don't want to connect to a database and make this more complex than it's supposed to be. So I'll say array. I'm just creating an array here. Array is equal to array empty. So let's just create an empty array to start with. And then, even though this array is equal to array is not necessary in PHP, you can simply go to this second line that I'm making now and it will still work. So I'm making an array which has a record. So I'll say ID. I want this to be called ID will be equal to, let's say 1 maybe. So ID, and then there's name, and then there's, let's try age, and then let's try gender. Like this. Okay, so name is John and age is 24, gender is male. So we have this this row here of data. So what I would want to do, this could be a row from the database, okay, because now if so what I could do now is use this name as a column to return a specific thing. So we don't have password here, so let's put gender here, like so. And then I will just tell it to return array name. Now that's because name represents this, and this is gender, which will represent, which will mean we'll get that. If we say age, we'll get that, and so on. So let's see that in action. If I refresh, you see now it tells me male, but who is this person? So I want to retrieve name. So I'll do that, John, right? So this could be a record from the database. It could do all the SQL. You can create an SQL using that name right there, and then retrieve that data and then get the particular column. So this is more interesting, obviously, but let's take it a step further. So what I want to do is, let's say function get data. So we're going to imagine this get data is something that reads data from the database. That way we are separating all these, compartmentalizing. So let me call this one private, like this. Let's say private function, because I won't be using it from the outside. So I want to use this to put this in here, but I want it to act like a real database. So I want to have several rows, not just one, but several of them. So before I empty that one, I'm going to say rows is equal to, actually I'll just do that, is equal to array. Why do I keep putting that 4 there? Okay, so I've created an array and then put it inside another array, and then I want to repeat the process here. So I will just duplicate that like this, 1, 2, 3, maybe something like this. So there's John here. So this one ID is going to be 2, and let's put another name, Mary, and let's change the age, and let's change the gender. And then this one, let's put Peter, and obviously ID number 3, ID number 4. Peter, maybe 34, male, and this one, let's say Jack, male, and maybe he's an old man, 84. And then Rose, and then what we do now, we return Rose. So we've created something that resembles a database here, because if I use get data here, just wait a minute, if I echo out get data like this, you will see what will happen here. So we're just returning this data here. I will put a pre-tag here so that we have a better look at how these, because without these pre-tags, the array is not so readable. Okay, so now regardless what I try to retrieve here, for as long as it doesn't exist in here, for as long as it's not one of these that exist, this is going to run, and when it runs, it's going to return the data that is here. So let's see that in action. I'll refresh. Call to unidentified function get data. Okay, so the issue here obviously is we didn't use this here. Now, if you don't use this even inside a class, it means you're calling a function that exists outside the class. That's what that means. So let's come back here and refresh. Array to string conversion. So I understand that, and that means we're trying to echo out an array and not a string. So let me say print readable, because that's the one we use to echo out arrays instead of strings. So let's do that. Finally, we get some data. So as you can see now, this is data that resembles what would look like a database result set. So there's one record here, there's one record there, and so on, right? Now imagine we returned this from the database and we just want to read, maybe we want record number 2, maybe the one with ID 2, or record with ID 4, or a record with the name Jack, something like this, right? So what would we do? Now, because the problem here is we are only given one parameter, we can't add more than this. And we can't change this to an array because it comes in as a string that contains this name right here. Okay? So unfortunately, here we are stuck, but we can still be creative. So at the top here, I can put a public property, which is, we'll call it find, because that's what we want to find. So like that. Okay, so once we set find, then we can use that as a value for a specific column. So because we know excuse me, that this will represent the column that we want, then we can put the value here and then just compare that. So let's see how we can do that. So here, once I instantiate the class, I can say db, and I set the find property to something I want to find. So what do I want to find? Let's say I want to find Jack, right? So I will say I want to find Jack. Okay, so now this could be in the database. So I'm going in the database and looking for a record with the name Jack. So the column is name and the data is Jack that I'm looking for. So great. So here already I want db name, right? So this is the column I'm looking for. So I want it to return this column. So well and good. So all I would do now is, because this has returned all the columns, all the rows, I'm just going to say rows is equal to that. Then let me come back here and check to confirm if the row is an array. So I'll say is array rows. So you can imagine this part, you've had your query and then the result has been returned into rows, and then here you're just checking if rows is indeed a row, an array. If nothing happens here, we're just going to echo out, not echo out actually, return we're just going to return could not find that data, like this. Okay, now if this is an array, we know it's an array, so let's loop through it. So I'm going to say for each rows as key and value. Now I don't need the key because the key is these here, which are completely useless to us. The IDs are here anyway, so we don't need that. So I'll remove that and equate that to a row. So this data contains a single row, this one contains all the rows, this one contains a single one. So we're now going in that one row, we want to retrieve a very specific set, a very specific column. So I'm going to check that column. If row with that column, now the column we are requesting will be saved in name because this is what we are sending here. So whatever we are sending there, it will be the column name. But I have to check because sometimes someone can send a column name that does not exist. So I'm going to say if is set, like this, if that is set, right? Like that. So we are pretty good. If it is set and, let's add one more, and the row name itself here is equal to finding here. So that's what we are finding. So if the row name is set and that same value in there is equal to the value we're looking for, which is find that one. Okay, if those two things are true, then we're in business. So what do we return? We return the row, the entire row, like this. Okay, so hopefully you have understood what's going on here. So this is representing the database, and we have read the data from the database. We check if it's an actual row. If it's not, we just return this. If it is, we loop through those rows and look for, from each row, we look for where it is exactly the same, where our value exists, and then we return that. So let's see here, I'm trying to return where the name is equal to Jack, which is this one here. So let's see if we'll get that result. So it's telling me undefined variable find. So this is a common mistake that I keep making. So please remember all the time that these variables require this in front of them to know that they are coming from the same class. So refresh, and as you can see, we've retrieved the data that we want, Jack, like that. Okay, so let's say maybe I want Mary. So I want Mary here. The find is equal to Mary. If I refresh, then I get Mary. Now, if obviously I want to use ID, let's say I want ID number 2, an item with ID number 2 here, I will use ID like that. And then let's come back here and refresh. Same record because it has number 2. So let me try number 4 and refresh. This is number 4. But let's try something that doesn't exist. Number 8, like that. What will happen? Could not find that data. So you see how you can read from the database just using the get there and not actually using a query every time, right? Now, this may not be making much sense because when you come back later to read your code, you see that db id. It won't make much sense. It would be nice if it says something like get id or get underscore id like this. Let's try it this way, get ID, or if you want, you can make it in such a way that it's a capital letter like this, get ID. Okay, so let's try it this way if this is the issue. So of course, get ID is not a column that exists, so we won't get this data. So we'll come back and say could not find. But if we tell it to remove the get and make this a small letter, then we're in business, right? Then it becomes ID. So right here where name exists, we can edit name because it's not fixed actually. We can just say name is equal to string replace. So we're replacing the get right? And what are we replacing it with? An empty string. And where are we doing that? Inside the name variable. So let's do it again this time, because now we have remained with ID with a capital letter. So we say string to lower like that, name. So we're reducing it to small letters. So we remove the get. This is what we're doing here. We remove this part, and then now that we're left with this, we make it small letters only, and then it becomes ID, right? So let me come back here and let me refresh. So now I can get ID, or let's try get name. Like that. Get name. There's no name with 4, obviously. So let's try and say Jack there. So there we go. Or let's try Mary. And there we go. So you get the idea here. But the problem here, obviously, is we are limited with how much information we can send through this get function. We can only send the name that was sent, and this is why we had to send the find over there. Okay, so in the next video we're going to look at another magic method called call, which gives us more power than what we can get from this get only.